Except for that episode 1 piece, every transcription I've performed for you so far has come from the show's first 7 years, when Simpson was composing for the program only sporadically. A mere 9 stories produced 18 piano arrangements. That's nearly half the total number of transcriptions I did in the entire project. From seasons 8 through 17, Simpson was scoring most, if not all, of each year's Doctor Who stories. So why is it that my transcriptions became more sporadic for the next 10 years of the program? The answer has to do with how British television productions used incidental music. Until 1970, a composer like Simpson was given a script and a meeting with the director to determine what scenes he or she would like music added. Simpson would compose and record the required pieces, and present a tape of musical cues that the director could use as he or she saw fit. In order to fit the length of certain scenes, Simpson was occasionally directed to have his tapes physically spliced, editing them to bring certain cues to the required length. However, during that time, there was no overdubbing. The music, as well as special effects, would be played in live in the studio during the recording of the program. This overall process meant that Simpson's compositions were completely up to his imagination and the moods the particular scenes required. So, as a composer might, he gave his music melodies, themes, etc., like a standalone piece. This explains why it was so easy for me to find inspiration from music of this period. Simpson was writing, to coin a phrase, tunes. Late 1970 into 71 was a watershed time then, as technology advanced in 2 vital respects, at least for Simpson. Firstly, the musical capability at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop took a giant step forward with the arrival of their first ever synthesizer, the EMS VCS 3. I am exactly the wrong person to talk about electronic music, synthesizers, and the like. I can tell you this. Dudley Simpson treated this device as an instrument, and once he decided upon the timbres and sounds it would generate, he composed a score and realized the music, in collaboration with longtime workshop sound designer and composer Brian Hodgson. True, as a cost-cutting measure, all of the music of Season 8 was realized by synthesizer alone. However, the music produced is absolutely one of Simpson's creative peaks. Secondly, the capability of post-production revolutionized how programs were made. Instead of having all the elements recorded as live, it was now possible to overdub music and special effects onto the recorded dramatic performance. This meant that time-coded videotapes of the program could be produced and provided to Simpson, who could then compose music to the exact second needed for a scene. This is, of course, the norm today. This new convenience, however, greatly changed Simpson's compositional style, for now he could see how his music would marry with the drama. This meant that, as he himself would say, his style changed from writing tunes to creating atmosphere. In the next 10 years' music, then, it would be more difficult for me to find the tunes that I was looking for, as atmosphere wasn't exactly what I was looking for in a standalone piano piece. They would still be there, have no fear. The Mind of Evil, specifically, has the extreme great fortune of being one of only 2 score recordings that exist in its entirety to this day. That is why the Masters theme, the Keller Machine theme, and the charming Dover Castle have been commercially released several times, contributing to this music's notoriety and longevity amongst fans of the program. It goes without saying, then, that these 3 recordings were the primary sources for the 3 resulting transcriptions. The Keller Machine theme, what I like to call the classic version, happens in some form in all 6 episodes of the story. Used mainly when the machine activates or is on the attack, the theme features in either the cliffhanger or the reprise or both of the first 4 episodes. We also hear different versions of the theme in other attack scenes, or more subtly, where we feel the machine's influence. I could hear many subtle variations in melody, synthesizer timbres, the harmony of the bass part, even key changes. There was no use resisting then, I would have to transcribe them. In the event, I used 12 distinct segments to make a big piece out of it, just as I did with the master suite. The unifying musical element of all variations of Keller Machine music is the left hand's threatening undulations, heard almost throughout, establishing the 6/8 time rhythmic foundation. Most of the harmonic underpinning puts the piece in B flat, although different variations suggest minor or major harmony. For all of his melodies, Simpson used the synthesizer to create distinctive timbres for his, quote, instruments. By far the most common timbre was made by merging a fundamental pitch with a kind of overtone a major third away. This has the effect of making the melodies harmonize themselves to a degree, and also create an instability in the harmony, because despite the relative brightness and happiness of that interval, this parallelism above the stable bass foundation makes many dissonances and resolutions possible. From the perspective of piano technique, the Keller Machine suite became an etude of a sort for practicing my legato thirds. They've never been better. After transcribing the various musical cues I wanted to use, the next task was to order them in a logical and musically satisfying way. I knew the classic theme should be heard early, but as a kind of introduction, I used the disturbing dissonant music heard in the episode 3 scene where the master orders his minion, the violent criminal Mailer, to handcuff the doctor to the chair where those undergoing the Keller process must sit. As many of the segments do, I begin with the undulations of the bass part, most commonly formed with root 5th octave. This undulation between B-flat and C-flat forms an ostinato heard throughout the majority of the piece. The so-called melody of this segment is made of a highly dissonant timbre of 3 pitches a half step apart from each other. Simpson uses pitch bending and a filter which gives the otherwise steady notes a machine gun-like attack, all possible on his synthesizer, which I imitate on the piano. As the pitch-bending melody fades away, the ostinato bass breaks its pattern and ascends in half steps up to E natural for its solo climax. After a written dramatic pause, the length determined by the performer, the classic theme is heard in full. With the same ostinato bass as the introduction, the melody slowly unfolds, consistent in its major third timbre. The melody begins on A, C sharp, and with the bass adds up to B flat, minor major 7, harmony. Twisting through some chromatics, the first phrase ends with a slow rise from D flat F, which is pure B flat minor, up to a dramatic resolution to B flat D, which is pure B flat major. The second phrase begins by jumping from those same notes up to D, F sharp, an augmented harmony above the solid root 5th octave foundation. Twisting again, transposed from the first phrase, next is a new thrice played figure, which seems to reinforce the augmented harmony, although it passes through other harmonies with its parallelism. The climax of the classic theme begins with a series of parallel, wiggly melodic figures, mirroring the movement of the bass. These start to ascend. Not long after, the bass follows suit, rising up as it did in the introduction. As the bass reaches its destiny of E natural, the melody surges up in triplets, finishing on another minor major 7 harmony. In some versions of the classic theme, it ends right there. Or, as it is in the released recording, there is a pitch-bending sound that slams the piece into the ground. I chose to use yet another version of the ending, which sounds like a tape effect, creating backwards and forwards echo of the ascending climactic triplets. In the program, such as in the episode 5 scene, where the doctor successfully immobilizes the creature, this echo goes on for some time, but I use 6 repetitions, enough to diminuendo and prepare for the next segment. The next brief cue is a moment of uneasy quiet, coming from the episode 6 scene where Barnum builds up the courage to lift up and carry the immobilized machine for the Doctor and Joe. The bass line, returning to B-flat, briefly is pared down to root fifth alone. The melody, meanwhile, for the only time in the piece, is in the timbre of minor thirds, rather than the major thirds just heard in the classic theme. Starting with C-sharp E, again suggesting minor harmony, but this time with the sharp 11 E, twists through similar chromatic figures as before and resolves on pure B-flat minor. Without pause, the bass line returns to its full size for the music of the episode 4 scene, where the Keller Machine first learns to move and materializes in front of a prison guard and kills him. The melody's timbre changes to a purer octave interval. After a crescendo, it proceeds through the same twisting chromatic motive in a B-flat minor version of the melody. As the guard does his job, not knowing the danger, the melody builds through a series of phrases featuring descending chromatic falls, spanning a major third. Continuing to build, the melody begins a similar series of ascending, wiggly lines, similar to the climax of the classic theme. The bass line does not follow suit with its ascent as readily, and in fact ends, or rather dissolves, in a blur of distortion that I represent by the use of my entire hand, palm and all, to get as many notes as I can while maintaining the primary roots, C-sharp and D. Above this palm smash, the melody also comes to an unexpected crash, which I represented in a creative way. In the episode 4 scene, these final notes are obscured by sound effects, but this ending melody is heard alone in episode 6, so that allowed me to confirm the correct notes. I couldn't do these super fast notes in octaves, but I could manage the finishing minor thirds that are doubled an octave apart. I experimented with making the left hand leap up to play the lower thirds, but decided I could consistently do it better with the single-handed stretch that you see. After another dramatic pause, this one intended to be in tempo, the next segment is the very first version of the Keller Machine music, heard underscoring Kettering's attack in episode 1. The music returns to the classic theme's left hand ostinato and the right hand's major third timbre. This time the melody begins on C-E, a more foreign harmony above B-flat, the 9th, and the sharp 11th. The next motive is not quite as chromatic as some of the other versions, and this phrase of the melody has a dominant 7th chord quality, resolving to a tremoloed A-flat C. However, the phrase ends with a literal fragment of the classic theme, that ascending line from the minor harmony up to the major harmony. From here, the melody skips to the wiggling ending phrases, with the first two motives repeated before that ascending climax begins in full. The left hand ascends together with the right hand as in the classic theme, and this time ends simply with no echo. After a brief, indeterminate pause, we hear a subdued echo of the melody just heard, music that accompanies a scene shortly after Kettering's death, where Joe goes to check on Barnum in the prison hospital. After the first part of that phrase, the pared down left hand ceases undulating, while the right hand's melody falls in a whole tone line, resolving to the brand new harmony of A minor. While this harmony settles, there is a fleeting, more innocent melodic line that concludes this moment. I took advantage of this musical settling and harmonic shifting to pivot the suite into segments that had different harmony to all the B-flat we've been hearing in the first half. The most unexpected version of the theme accompanies episode 2's scene, where Captain Chin Lee, channeling the power of the Keller Machine, incapacitates the undercover Sergeant Benton. The melody is made completely of the theme's wiggly ascending motive, with each stretched rhythmically to 1.5 measures. Meanwhile, the left-hand accompaniment is most intriguing. There's a hint of the root fifth interval of the normal bass line, here inverted to the top two notes. The bottom note, though, is a major sixth below the next note, making the complete structure wider than an octave and harmonically ambiguous. Adding the melody above, it does form a commonplace harmony, E major, with the dominant 7th D in the bass. As the motive ascends, however, the harmony becomes less clear. When the bass line finally begins to ascend for its climax, the right hand oscillates between the same two pairs of notes for 3 measures, in an erratic rhythm, reflecting perhaps the torture in Benton's mind. The ascending bass begins by jumping down a half step lower than it started, but from there it rises a diminished 5th in total. Reaching its peak, the top 2 notes of the 3-note left hand begin a half-step trill, imitating the distorted electronic trill of the synthesizer. The melody peaks a tiny bit later, ending with the same notes as the classic theme. At this point, though, it carries on, wavering between the last 2 pairs of notes, and because the filtered sound was a vital part of this ending, as it was in the introduction, I elected to hammer out these repeated notes in the exact number of repetitions made so easy by the synthesizer. In the middle of the right hand's vacillations, the left hand's trill ends and their parallel fourths sink into nothingness. The ending notes of this melody, E-flat G, connected nicely with the melody of the next segment, which is the first of 3 where the bass line transposes up to B natural. It made good musical sense to group these 3 segments together. This first B natural segment comes from a brief scene in episode 6 where Barnum is wandering around the empty prison. Beginning with an augmented harmony, the E-flat G link, this brief phrase ends suggesting dominant 7th harmony. Although the timbre is again based on major thirds, both notes are also doubled at the octave, making a thicker, richer sound. I wanted to reflect this in my arrangement and make it distinctively different from the timbre of the classic theme. To that end, the right hand plays the main melody note in octaves with the harmonized major third in the middle. Where possible, I reach up with the left hand to play the lower major third harmony. The unfortunate effect of this, most notable in the next segment, is that the undulating bass rhythm isn't possible to maintain in a steady manner, but I keep it going as best I can. At this point, you've heard it so much, you probably think you heard it anyway. This next segment actually comes from earlier in episode 6, as the machine begins to break free of the coil the Doctor and the Master have used to immobilize it. With some rapid-fire rhythms required for this melody, the left hand's bass had to be omitted a little more often to be faithful to this whole-tone tinged melody. It lands on a strong hint of B minor major 7. Note also that this melody's timbre only has a doubled octave, rather than both notes doubled. The final B natural cue comes from much earlier, in episode 3. The Keller Machine is getting restless. The prisoners are restless, and the next man to be processed is Mailer. The left hand is pared down to root 5th for the last time. It rises sporadically towards the end, landing on E-flat, which will be a useful pivot note. The right hand's timbre, though the same, wasn't feasible to execute as in the previous segment. Because I took another opportunity to play a filtered version of this melody, tremolo octaves, the major third fits in the middle, held during the tremolo. When I came across the music from the reprise to episode 3, I knew I had found the climax of the suite. After transcribing the incredibly rich and powerful sound Simpson devised, and experimented with performing the music on piano, I was giddy. The chaotic intensity of this music supports the scene as Chin Lee, again channeling the Keller Machine, traps the American delegate, Senator Alcott, and just as he is about to die of his fear of communism, naturally, the Doctor arrives to dispel the hallucination. One reason why this music is perfect for the suite is because it begins with a reprise of the classic theme, like a recapitulation in a sonata, or returning to a song's melody in a jazz performance. To connect to it smoothly, the previous E-flat bass acts like a 4 chord, allowing a return to the B-flat bass of the theme. I also elected to hold over the right hand's D-flat F for an extra measure to further solidify this resolution to B-flat minor. This leads directly into the first 10-measure phrase of the classic theme. At its conclusion, the music turns it up a notch, sticking with the B-flat major harmony from the previous phrase and altering the timbre back to the added double octave used 2 segments ago. Again, the left-hand ostinato bass must take a few breaks to make the melody happen, but it's worth it. Following another twisting chromatic motive, the melody drops shockingly through a perfect fifth's worth of chromatic notes. Again, too fast to play in octaves, but it sounds great in tenths. That's a third plus an octave. Mimicking the slowly rising line from the previous phrase, this phrase ends with that line transposed up a major third. The next phrase turns it up another notch, and this intensity is reflected by a unique timbre, this time not just made from major thirds, but full major triads. The end notes of the last phrase, D, F sharp, are made incandescent by erupting into a D major triad atop the merciless ostinato in B flat. At this spot, I admit I got creative, because that ostinato has been very well represented in the suite, but I felt it also needed to, for this insanely powerful moment in the music, turn it up. So I did. I pushed the left hand down an octave to the bottom of the piano. That's not officially how it goes, but I did it. Because I wanted you, like Dudley Simpson may have done, to fear for your life. Don't worry, the doctor arrives in the nick of time, maybe even before. This triad timbre is brief, and soon slips back to the major third plus octave timbre for a howling line repeated 3 times, a variation on the thrice-played figure from the classic theme. As I listened to this clip, it felt like there was more there, and I soon found a subtle, oscillating G-flat ringing above the melee, so I added a pulsing minor ninth that simultaneously sounded that note, acted as an answer to the howling melody, and also sustained the F of the howl. I can't sustain this much longer, so the suite completes this recap plus denouement with Simpson's final rising phrase of the classic theme, reorchestrated for octaves plus major third in the right hand, pounding bass in the left. When the final E minor major 7 peak is reached, the thick orchestration falls away. The doctor has arrived to save us all. Only the 2 notes of the melody remain, rapidly tremoloed between the hands. And as Chin-Li frees herself from the power of the Keller Machine, the melody distorts and bends in a clustered diminuendo. The suite ends with a brief coda, a middle register echo of past variations, using music from back in episode 2, where, as Chin-Li disables Benton, the Keller Machine, miles away from the scene, deactivates and is still. Thanks a lot for daring to watch episode 20, part 2 of the Dudley Simpson is Doctor Who project. Stay tuned for a rare part 3, the score, in all its glory. Subscribe, like, share, and comment. See you next time.